Welcome to episode 2, A Remarkable Beginning. We started in the beginning of the Bible with the beginning of everything. Let's jump forward to the beginning of the second part of the Bible, which is the New Testament. It's written by a man called Matthew, and it starts like this in Matthew 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. It's not a particularly exciting start, is it? A genealogy is basically a family tree. And sure enough, what follows is a long list of names, a shortened version of the family tree of Jesus. Let's speed things up by jumping down the page where Matthew gives us a short summary of this family tree. In Matthew 1:17 he says, "So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations." So the story of the birth of Jesus is a 2,000-year epic that happens in 3 stages, if you like. The first stage is from a man called Abraham to a king called David. And then secondly, from David to the deportation. And finally, thirdly, from the deportation to Jesus. So let's look at the first stage. Abraham, also called Abram, lived about 4,000 years ago, about 2,000 years before Jesus even existed on earth. He lived in a city called Ur, which is in what we now call Iraq. This is how his story starts. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred, or your family, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." You see, he was nobody special, but God appeared to him, asked him to leave his home and step out into the unknown. At the same time, God made 2 promises. Abraham would become a great nation, that's the first one. And secondly, he would be a blessing to all peoples on earth. Those are 2 amazing promises, aren't they? Particularly since Abram was 75 years old, and he and his wife seemingly couldn't have any children. But amazingly, Abram and Sarah did have a son, and they called him Isaac. He had a son who was called Jacob, and he had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. It's a long story of how they were slaves in Egypt, but God used Moses to bring them out of Egypt to the land of Israel. And eventually they became a great nation, ruled by a king called David. It took about 1,000 years, but it would seem the first of those remarkable promises to Abraham was fulfilled. They had indeed become a great nation. But what about the second part? How is this going to be a blessing to the whole earth? The answer to that question won't become clear until we get to the end of our story. But we see that the start of the answer comes when God sends a message to King David, a king called David, through a prophet. And this is what the prophet said to King David. It comes in 2 Samuel 7. "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom." David had a son called Solomon, who ruled over what has been called the Golden Age for Israel, the best time in Israel's history. Solomon also built a magnificent temple, a house for God's name. At first sight, you might have thought that Solomon was the answer and the fulfillment of the promise made to David. But we stopped mid-sentence in that message from God to David. Let's read on. God says in Samuel, "I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son." Now, these promises are as remarkable as the promises made to Abraham. God is going to establish a kingdom that will last forever. And the king of this kingdom will be God's own son. And yet, in some way, he will also be David's offspring. Well, you might be thinking, how on earth could that be the case? Clearly then, Solomon was not the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to David. There was more to come. Again, the Christmas story confronts us with a big question. In the promises made in the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, then to Abraham, and here to David, do I see God actively working in a seemingly chaotic world to bring about his purposes, to bring about an eternal kingdom? Or do I dismiss it all as rather fanciful and some sort of a fairy tale? Nothing to do with me. And if you're undecided, remember we haven't reached the end of our story yet.